Alrighty, what is going on, guys? It is your boy Garage Gaming here, and today we'll be looking at the light cruisers of the Royal Navy. Now, this is not a video about how to play them. Have a look at my Navy tree. Yeah, no, not happening. No, this is more about why they're sort of where they are in the tree, the design philosophy behind each one, and yeah, just some interesting little tidbits about them. You could say this is kind of like another mini lecture. Yeah, just about these light cruisers. I think they're pretty neat, the selection that they've come across. There used to be only like one, now there's 4 per nation, I think, or something. Yeah. So, yeah, the British light cruiser line I thought would be the most fulfilling in terms of information I could present in a video. Haven't done a video in a long time on this topic, so yeah. So to start off with, let's look at HMS Enterprise. So this is a bit of an odd-looking ship, you know, a twin turret up the front. Let me just get rid of this for a second. So yeah, we have a 2-gun turret up the front, 2 6-inch guns, and then it sort of goes back with these sort of single mount 6-inch guns all the way around the ship. Should be 5 up the back, and then 2 guns up the front. Now, this is an E-class cruiser, or an Emerald-class cruiser. The British are very fond of just calling one class of ship by, you know, a single type of, like a single word or a single letter. The R-class battleships, the Duke-class frigates, things like that. And yeah, so the previous class of cruiser, I believe they were called the Danais, or Danae, I don't know how to say it. And yeah, so these are the E-class cruisers. These were laid down at the end of the First World War. So around 1918, these were ordered, and these were meant to counter German light cruisers that they believe were being developed. And they're pretty interesting. So this isn't very representative of what we would get in 1918, because this is actually, as I found out, this is the 1944 configuration of the ship, so basically just before these were put into their training, their reserve role, and then furthermore scrapped. This is essentially the optimal version of the Emerald, so of the Enterprise that we would ever see. So it's got its catapult at the back here with the fighter, and it's absolutely decked out with anti-aircraft armament. So we've got 20mm Oerlikon cannons, I don't know how to say it. And then we have like 40mm, sort of every once in a while. I don't think, no, those aren't 40mm, are they? Christ, can't I remember? Yeah, they are 40mm, I don't know. The 2-pounder is not the Bofors. So yeah, but I'm getting a bit sidetracked here. So this is how the ship would appear in 1944, apparently, although I did read somewhere that that fighter, the catapult, was deleted at some point, so yeah. But these were interesting, and the reason they've picked this is because these ships were pretty extraordinary. Enterprise especially has a very interesting history, so the Emeralds were originally going to be a trio of ships, but that was later just brought down to 2, so we have Emerald and Enterprise. Their little distinction is, at the start of the Second World War, they were the fastest light cruisers in the Royal Navy, so nothing else could really match them when it came to speed. They displace, at standard, 7,580 tons. They're 173.7 metres long with a beam of 16.6 metres. 8 Yarrow boilers propel the ship along at, I think it's 32 knots or 33 knots closer to. They have 80,000 shaft horsepower, powering 4 shafts and to their respective propellers, for being the number they came to for the speed that they wanted to achieve. So you can really see here, just at the back here, I think most later cruisers only have 3, although I could be mistaken on that one. So yeah, very interesting ships indeed for a couple of reasons. So the Emerald is a little bit different to the Enterprise in a couple of ways, the major one being this turret up the front here. So this turret was an experimental turret fitted in the 30s, a little bit after these ships. So they originally looked fairly identical, but then Enterprise got this experimental 2-gun turret. and this would be important on the later Leander class cruisers, which would come afterwards. This turret is essentially what they use on the Leanders instead of these more sort of earlier, single mounts. And what you have here is a much more sort of protective layer. This turret won't stop much, but at least it's fully enclosed compared to these, which are obviously not. So, you're limiting your exposure there. It's not like a battleship turret where it would stop a capital ship grade weapon or anything. Indeed, the armor's not that thick on these at all. But yeah, so pretty standard for cruisers at the time. It has a 3-inch belt, and then the deck armor should only be 1 inch. Yep, perfect. And then the frontal, sort of at the front of what would be the sort of ends of the Citadel, I think they're like 2 inches at the front and 1.5 at the back or something. It's a bit weird. Maybe they changed it, I'm not too sure. But yeah, so not very well armoured at all. I mean, it's only a light cruiser. These are designed for speed. Now, Enterprise is interesting as well because it is famous for what is known as the Enterprise Cup. So in Africa, like Kenya and Uganda, and one other country, I think it's like Tanzania, some of the sailors from the ship donated them a cup, and they have a big rugby union game every year or every couple of years or something like that. And yeah, so it's actually after this ship here. Yeah, what else about it? There's one more thing about its armament that I can't remember. Oh yeah, so it's not represented on this version of the ship that we have in game, because this version is from 1944 apparently. But going into the war, these actually had the heaviest broadside, heaviest torpedo armament of any Royal Navy cruiser at the beginning of the war. So these actually had an additional set of, they had 2 more torpedo tubes, so they had 16 torpedoes in total in 4 quadruple mounts. I'm not sure where that other one went, probably back here. You'd have to look at an old photograph of it, but yeah. So HMS Enterprise, when I first stumbled upon this ship, I was like, oh, it's pretty interesting. But yes, it turned out it was actually quite a significant ship. I also believe that this sort of deck house, this superstructure up the front here, is essentially what they used when they were designing, I think, the County class cruisers. So they have a very similar deck structure. Because of the size of these ships, they were very easy to upgrade with all the additional anti-aircraft armament, and I believe these are, they've actually got radars and things like that attached and installed onto the ship. This stuff is makes the ships very top heavy, so you have to take a lot into consideration when you're adding additional anti-aircraft protection and things like radars and stuff. They start putting a lot of weight on the top of the ship, so this thing was fairly large, and as a result, this is also the last Royal Navy pre-treaty cruiser before the Washington Naval Treaty came out. And yeah, if you don't know much about that, I'd recommend looking into it, because the Washington Naval Treaty and the London Naval Treaty really did set the stage for essentially what nations could build as ships. So yeah, moving on to the Dido. Alrighty, so here we have HMS Dido. Now this one is pretty interesting because this actually comes after the Leander chronologically, not before it, but in the tech tree it's obvious to see why they put it behind. So the Didos were small trade protection cruisers primarily meant to operate in the Mediterranean, mainly against the Italians. Now these are pretty interesting ships, and the most obvious parallel you can draw with these is the Atlanta class cruisers of the United States Navy. It is poignant to point that out, but I think that they served 2 completely different roles, even though you end up with a fairly similar design. So the Atlanta class, with their 5-inch 38s, the first 4 of them had 12, the rest of them had 10 only, some had even less. The Atlanta class were built as destroyer flotilla leaders and scout cruisers and doing all that kind of stuff, whereas these were meant more for convoy escorts. The Atlanta class is really better for any kind of AA work, in my opinion, primarily because the 5-inch 38 is more of it's a destroyer weapon, but it's really good at that sort of mid to short range anti-aircraft work. The 5.25-inch gun that was used on these cruisers, the Didos, these are actually anti-surface weapons. They may look familiar to some of you because these are also the secondary weapons on the King George V class battleships and later HMS Vanguard. So it's only these three classes that the 5.25-inch gun was actually used. Later on, when they put these on HMS Vanguard with the radar fire control, or indeed upon the King George V, the King George V class were sent to the Pacific with these turrets. So the King George V's would have, I think it was like 4 per side, so 16 in total. And what the Japanese pilots were finding is that when they would engage, what they were used to with the 5-inch 38 and their flak, they were suddenly finding that radar-directed 5.25-inch fire was just knocking aircraft out of the sky at ranges they were not used to. So these were fairly effective in the role of anti-aircraft work, but they were primarily designed as anti-surface, in the role of anti-surface warfare. So here we have Dido herself. Pretty interesting ship, honestly. Just a very, very generalized light cruiser design. These things weigh, at standard, about 5,700 tons, 156 meters long, 15.4 meters wide. Interestingly enough, they have 4 shafts, 62,000 shaft horsepower. Sorry. So, you know, you're getting this same sort of cruiser layout. And yeah, just the very fast-firing gun. She could do 32.25 knots, which is a pretty respectable speed. Honestly, like, these ships were very, very ubiquitous with the Mediterranean fleet, just, you know, protecting convoys. I believe 16 of these things were built, which is pretty interesting. The later sub-variant of this ship actually had, I think, this turret removed purely because I don't think they had enough. These had a limited production run, and they sort of had to pick and choose. I think it may have been an issue with the amount of, like, you know, if they had to pick between putting it on a cruiser or putting it on the King George V class battleships, they probably would have put it on there. So yeah, they served pretty well. I think a couple of these were lost, actually. I think, unusually, like, they had like 5 lost, which isn't, I don't know, percentage-wise, I think that may be higher than like the Leander class loss rate, but yeah. So very solid, well-built cruiser, fast-firing, 5.25-inch guns, and yeah, they have pretty colourful service histories. So the ships of the class were the Dido, the Argonaut, the Charybdis, I don't know how to say that, the Phoebe, Hermione, the Bonaventure, the Scylla, the Naiad, Cleopatra, Sirius, and the Euryalus. And then there's the Bellona subclass, which has Bellona, Royalist, Diadem, Black Prince, and Spartan. So yeah, pretty interesting class of ships. Now we'll move on to the one that I know the best, the Leanders. Okay, so here we have Her Majesty's New Zealand ship, Leander. As you can see, very similar turrets to the the Enterprise. So yeah, so these were light cruisers built for the Royal Navy, basically after the Emeralds. I think they were in, what was it, one of the heavy cruisers, the York class, really were the basis of the design for these. So they wanted to get a ship that would be out there for commerce protection. You got to remember the Royal Navy was built for the Empire, which included the dominions of Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand, many crown colonies like Fiji, British Malaya, Ceylon, the British Raj itself, all of Africa, to protect all of the trade coming to Britain from all of these places. You needed cruisers. Cruisers were the best ships, not as small as destroyers, not as big as a full-size capital ship. You can rely on cruisers. So a group of these were built. They built 8 of the ships, so we'll go through the names in a second, because these served for a number of different navies, not just during the war but afterwards. Leander herself was actually, sent to the New Zealand Navy. the Royal New Zealand Navy, sorry, and then there were a few that were specifically built for the Royal Australian Navy, which I would personally love to see in the game. So yeah, 7,270 tons, displacement at standard, 169 meters long, 17.1 meters wide. So they had, what is it? Sorry, 6 boilers, 72,000 shaft horsepower, 4 shafts. You know, fairly decent. So in terms of armament, I think I forgot to mention the armament on the Enterprise, but that's okay because it's basically all the same. So these are 6-inch gun-armed cruisers. Fairly considerable AA. I think this is a later war modification again. You know, nothing like the American ships, but, you know, fairly consistent. And yeah, so the Leanders were interesting because, I mean, you know, 8 of them were built, but 3 were lost, which is pretty incredible. Also, were equipped with some torpedo tubes. The majority of light cruisers around the world at the time had this happen. So yeah, so Leander was built for the Royal Navy initially, but it was transferred over in 1941. We had the Orion after it, the Neptune, the Ajax, and the Achilles. Now, I do believe the Achilles was sent to the Royal New Zealand Navy as well, and then Achilles later went to the Indian Navy as, I think it was Delhi? New Delhi? No, it was Delhi, that's right. And I remember Achilles was actually used in the movie, what was it again? They used a goddamn Des Moines as or Baltimore as the admiral. They made a movie about the Admiral Graf Spee and the sinking of it, and they used one of the original ships. I think they used the Achilles, yeah. I can't remember that for sure. And so yeah, so we had the last 3 ships were Amphion, I don't know how to pronounce that, Amphion, Apollo, and Sydney, which used to be Phaeton. So Amphion was sent to us as HMAS Perth, that was sunk. And then we had Apollo sent to us as HMAS Hobart, and that one actually survived. And then finally, of course, HMAS Sydney, a very famous ship because it got into a kerfuffle with a well-known German raider, the Cormoran, and they were sort of like mutually killed off the Western Australian coast. And no Royal Australian Navy sailors actually survived that. So it was, I think it was the worst Australian Navy tragedy to date during wartime. So yeah, the difference between the sort of the ships sent to the Royal Australian Navy and these ones was they actually had, I think they had an additional funnel, or Sydney, what happened again? Was it Sydney that had the additional funnel, or was that a mock funnel that they operated with? I believe that these ships had modified like an additional funnel. So yeah, as you can see with like Leander here, everything's truncated up into one funnel, whereas Sydney had an additional funnel right here. They were also more like your typical round funnels, not these sort of teardrop ones from above. So yeah, the Leanders served very well in their intended role. Lost a couple, but you know, that's what happens. A lot of these were mainly just sort of palmed off to the Commonwealth navies, while the actual Royal Navy itself got their Arethusa and the Town class. Of course, we don't actually have the Arethusa in the game, that class of ships, but we do indeed have the Town class, which I will go on to next. So the Town class were the big boys of the Royal Navy in terms of the light cruisers. Basically, these and the Crown Colonies, to me, are the sort of penultimate late war British cruisers, or sort of mid to late war British cruisers. These are technically pre-war cruisers because they entered service in 1937. These are also the Belfast. Belfast still exists, so that's another one. Another sort of little thing, because as we know, the Royal Navy had to scrap all of their ships, and yeah, so Belfast was the last one left, and that was thankfully preserved, so we can now go out and see it today. So yeah, the Town class cruisers, 10 were built, 4 were lost. Typical fashion, happened to be a war, so what do you expect? And yeah, there's 3 distinct subclasses of this ship. as we have here represented in game, we have the Southampton, then there's the Gloucestershire and the Edinburgh class, subclasses, sorry. And so yeah, they all have differing weights, but Southampton here was simply 11,540 tons, so pretty heavy. We're starting to get into the sort of big boy territory here. You know, 4 shafts again, 32 knots on the Southampton. The Gloucestershire and Edinburghs can go a little tiny bit faster. But we probably want to get into the meat and potatoes of the ship, which is its armament, which there is an actual very interesting fact about these sort of 3-gun turrets. So they have 12 6-inch guns, which is pretty formidable armament, compared to the Leanders, which only have 8. So, you know, you're looking at an extra 4 guns on... although you're looking at an extra 3,000 tons on top of that. And these 3-gun turrets have a very interesting design feature. So I don't think I'll be able to show you on here very easily, but the middle gun on the 3-gun turret is actually recessed slightly back from the other 2. And one of the reasons is so that the gun crew can stand, because you got to remember there's a gun crew in all of these turrets, and they can all stand sort of staggered, you know, rather than interfering with each other's workspace. This also helps with the muzzle, what's it called? So when the guns fire, they can disrupt each other's, you know, when all 3 of them fire at once. Some other nations came up with technical solutions like sort of staggering the fire. The Americans ran into this problem because they have 3-gun turrets. The French really ran into this problem with their 4-gun turret ships, like the Dunkirks and the Richelieus. So, you know, the British solution I really like, because it's just, oh, we'll just recess the gun back a bit and we'll be right. And as a result, because of that sort of slight difference, the shells weren't interfering with each other and throwing the guns off. So yeah, the typical, I don't know if the 4-inch armament's on this ship. Not too sure. Can't really see it anywhere. They've got the... oh yeah, the 4-inch armament's here. So yeah, they had fairly substantial anti-aircraft firepower. I think it was either these or... I think it was these ships. One of the... So some of these ships had the rear turret. One of the rear turrets, I think it was this one, removed in place of additional anti-aircraft armament. A lot of people don't understand why, like, how important, like, aircraft really came into their own in the Second World War and were a massive danger to shipping. And during that stage of the war, the Axis navies really depleted, and there wasn't really that much, you know, surface action going on. Theoretically, you can use the 6-inch guns in an anti-aircraft role. Practically speaking, removing this for extra 40mm, you know, 2 quad 40mm Bofors mounts, you know, really made a difference in, you know, essentially taking out what was the actual threat. This is kind of similar to, you know, people talking about the Shermans, the 76 and the 75 Sherman. The majority of targets a 75 Sherman would face would be soft targets like infantry and anti-tank guns. You want to have weapons to deal with threats that are, you know, there and present. I think only a few ships are actually modified with this. I think some of the last 3, so yeah. Going through the ships, we have Newcastle, Southampton, Sheffield, Glasgow, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Gloucestershire, Belfast, and Edinburgh. So, let's find out which ones were sunk. So, oh wow, so Southampton was actually scuttled following an air attack off Malta, and God, yeah, no, definitely a couple of them were sunk, which is really, you know, I don't think it's fair to judge ships' designs and performance based off if they were sunk or not, because at the end of the day, this was a war. Bit beefier armor compared to the sort of earlier cruisers, so they definitely had a better go of it when it came to their belt armor. But, you know, surface action wasn't really a thing with these ships. I think the majority of them were sunk by, what's it called? I think the majority of them were sunk just by, like, air attacks and things like that. But yeah. But it's cool to see that, honestly, that this is the last sort of large unit from the Second World War that the Royal Navy have preserved. And it's cool to see it represented in game. Because after this ship, you basically only have the Crown Colony class, the Crown Colony class cruisers to sort of go off, which are basically just like, to me, the Crown Colonies are really just like slightly lighter rebuilds of these ships. You know, they're kind of like the counties being the Kents being smaller versions of the county class cruisers. You know, after this you get the Minotaurs. You know, they're even smaller, so you know you're not really looking at much past this, which is a shame because it was just the nature of the war. Like, you know, the Minotaurs, they only had 3 turrets, and then past that you've got, well, one of the Tiger class, but the Tiger class is already in the game. So yeah, this is basically it when you come to cruisers. You can get the Kent and the County class coming in here, and the Hawkins class cruisers. But, you know, past that, we'd have to start looking at the capital ships. So yeah, didn't really go over the design rationale of these ships much. But essentially, all Royal Navy cruisers are merchant protection cruisers. So think about the opposite of what the Germans were doing when they were designing their capital ships. So you've got high endurance, relatively high speed light cruisers, plenty of firepower, lots of anti-aircraft defences towards the end of the war, and instead of being purely offensively focused, these ships are meant to do the sort of boring but vital job of protecting convoys and things like that. So yeah, hope I haven't bored you half to death simply talking about warships, and you know, I hope that one day we'll have Battlecruiser Hood and, you know, the Warspite and Bismarck and things like that in the game in the future, but, you know, we'll have yet to see. Until then, I hope you all enjoy, and yeah, speak to you all about this next time.